Bob Reilly is director of the Westminster Institute. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. No, we won't hold that against you. Reader's Digest, National Review, many other publications. He was former director of the Voice of America. He's taught at the National Defense University, served in the White House and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And he was also participated in Operation Iraqi Freedom. I ask you to welcome Bob Reilly.
Jeff, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. You may have seen that the lecture topic was switched. Jeff actually came to the Westminster Institute for a talk on this subject, and in our email exchanges, that topic stayed at the title, and my topic title was in the text message. So do you know what I'm talking about tonight? If you do, and you tell me, I'd appreciate it. I think you know it's Deciphering the Middle East, why the United States usually gets it wrong. But I will touch upon the subject of jihad. And you may notice that this is such a distressing subject that I will have an adult beverage with me up here while we're discussing it. It's also kind of body language to let you know that I am not a Muslim. Now, you may have noticed in the news that when the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran went through Italy and France, at the state dinners which he attended, no wine was served. I've been to France and Italy many times. I've never seen a meal without wine. And that was done so President Rouhani's Islamic faith would not be offended by the presence of alcoholic beverages, which brought to mind a memory of Winston Churchill when he was Prime Minister and King Saud was visiting him at 10 Downing Street. King Saud's emissary arrived at 10 Downing Street to go over the requirements for the dinner with Churchill, and he said to the Prime Minister, for religious reasons, no alcoholic beverages will be served in His Majesty's presence. To which Churchill responded, champagne will be served before dinner, Bordeaux will be served with dinner, and cognac will be served after dinner, also for religious reasons. And so it was. So now I better move on and address our subject of deciphering the Middle East, why the United States usually gets it wrong. So I think we need to pull back and consider a little history on the relationship between the United States and the Middle East. And first of all, we'll notice that there wasn't much of one, if one at all, for the major part of the history of the United States. Why? Because the United States didn't have any vital strategic interests there. The feeling was apparently mutual, as no Middle Eastern country opened an embassy in Washington until the Ottomans in 1873. It was not until 1909 that the U.S. State Department created its Near Eastern Affairs Division. In 1913, Assistant Secretary of State Francis Huntington Wilson announced, quote, "It's no place to waste ammunition," unquote. Well, apparently some things changed. Now, the United States, as is obvious from our origin, has consistently been an anti-colonial power. And this has given us a certain perspective on the world. So when we began noticing the Middle East and considering our relationship to it, the first thing we noticed was it was the object of imperial powers. And at the time of our first serious association with it, it was subject to Ottoman imperialism. And so the notion arose should only the Arab peoples be given their freedom, if the shackles of Ottoman imperialism could be lifted from them, the Arabs would naturally assume the blessings of liberty and self-government. Because our perspective was, if you don't have the exercise of these rights, it's because someone has taken it from you. The Ottomans insisted on entering World War I, as you know. Churchill had promised them if they stayed out of it, the British Empire would guarantee the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. Foolishly, they entered it. The empire collapsed at the end of the war, and what took the place of Ottoman imperialism was British and French imperialism. So the story within the United States changed a little bit. If only the Arab peoples could be freed from Western, French, and British imperialism, the Arab peoples would assume upon themselves the blessings of liberty and self-government, right? And the United States was known as an anti-imperial power. At the conclusion of the war, we pressured both the French and British to abandon their colonial possessions. And then in 1956, in the Suez Crisis, Eisenhower cemented this reputation by opposing the Israelis, the French, and the British when they repossessed the Suez Canal after Nasser had expropriated it from them. And Eisenhower told them to get out. So understandably, we were popular. The United States was admired. And so we thought, now that the British and French imperial powers have withdrawn, the Arab peoples will take upon themselves self-government, the blessings of liberty. The British and the French, exhausted from the war and their imperial endeavors, eventually withdrew. And the United States, because of the strategic interest it had there, principally, obviously, oil, had to fill in their shoes. And we made an amazing discovery, that the problems in the Middle East, or a good deal of them, were not a product of Ottoman imperialism or Western imperialism. They were indigenous to the region. Only now they were our problems. The United States formulated a foreign policy in respect to the Middle East from Truman on, because of the vital strategic asset of oil there, that we would not allow any antagonistic hegemonic power to gain control of those supplies. This policy was reiterated. This was a bipartisan policy. It was reiterated by every president. You may recall Jimmy Carter, hardly known as a hardcore president on foreign policy, repeating this after the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and worries persisted that this may be a lurch toward the Middle Eastern oil resources through the Salon Tunnel into Iran, that he made the announcement repeating this policy, saying that if any hostile power attempted to become the hegemon in the Middle East and control these, that would be a casus belli for the United States. Consistently articulated. Now, of course, the Soviet Union fell apart, but this policy persisted in a slightly reformulated fashion, since we were no longer worried about an antagonistic hegemonic power from outside the Middle East. We then concentrated on any local hegemons whose ambitions would imperil the strategic interests of the United States. And so it was that when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, took it over, made several military feints into Saudi Arabia, that President George Bush Sr. created the coalition to throw Saddam out. This was consistent with U.S. foreign policy since the end of the war. Now, I was a supporter of that policy at the time. So things are about to get much rougher. I'm going to take a little sip of this. As I was in the subsequent war, Operation Iraqi Freedom. As Jeff told you, I participated in a minor way in that. Now, the problem with the first Gulf War is that President Bush didn't finish it. He thought that the defeat of the Iraqi armed forces was sufficient to generate internal forces within Iraq that would have overthrown Saddam Hussein, meaning he didn't have a sufficient understanding of the Ba'ath Party apparatus or the mukhabarat or military intelligence in Iraq. That wasn't going to happen. I was doing a weekly television radio show at the Voice of America, WorldNet TV, on an anniversary of that war, and I had in the studio Richard Haas, who's now the head of the Foreign Affairs Council. He had been the principal National Security Council advisor during the first Gulf War. We were off camera and off mic, and I said to him, why didn't you call the defeated generals to the tent? Because the rap on this is, well, we would have had to go to Baghdad. No, we wouldn't have. Why didn't you call the defeated generals to the tent and simply say, gentlemen, you have 48 hours to reconstitute your regime without Saddam Hussein. And after 48 hours, if you haven't done that, we're not coming for Saddam, we're coming for you. So let's all reset our watches, and good luck to you. So I said to Mr. Haas, why didn't you do that? And his answer was startling. He said the generals who could have done that wouldn't have come to the tent. The generals of a defeated army won't come to the tent? That means you haven't defeated the army. And so it was the United States consciously allowed the Republican Guard to escape its grasp before imposing terms upon it, thus necessitating another war more than a decade later. In the tremendous criticism that this Iraq policy has come under, particularly the fiasco that Operation Iraqi Freedom eventually became, I always say, yes, I know, this turns out to have been a terrible mistake, but how would you have ended the war? And she said, what do you mean? Oh, so the war was still going on. If you remember the northern no-fly zone, the southern no-fly zone, if you remember that American and Allied aircraft were being fired upon by Iraqi anti-aircraft guns weekly, tell me how you would have ended that war. How would you have sustained the effort in the no-fly zones and the humanitarian effort? When I was in Baghdad in the spring of 2003, I was living in Saddam's Republican palace. I can't tell you how bizarre an experience that was. But on the marble entrance was an Arabic inscription, which I asked my Kurdish friend to read. And it said, this palace was rebuilt in honor of Saddam Hussein's victory over the United States in 1991. You laugh, but it was. More than a decade later, he was still there. And he was still there in defiance of the provisions of the ceasefire agreement. So if you win a war and you don't enforce the provisions of the ceasefire agreement, you haven't won the war. And everyone throughout the Middle East, believe me, could read that inscription in the Republican palace. So I think it behooved President George W. Bush to finally bring him into compliance and end that war. But not the way we did. That involved some major misunderstandings. Here's one of them. A former Israeli intelligence agent said to me before Operation Iraqi Freedom, "I hope you understand that no one there wishes you well." No one there wishes you well. Don't leave yet. Oh no, you're just going to the bar. What did he mean by that? He meant that none of the countries, none of the Arab countries in the Middle East wished us success. It was not in their interest that we succeed in the terms in which we define success. So if you're going, go knowing that no one there wishes you well, because the terms in which you define success, which is a free, constitutional, rule of law, market economy in Iraq, was inimical to the interests of the Ba'athist regime in Syria, because it would delegitimize it, and it was certainly against the interests of Iran, for reasons we never seem to articulate or completely understand. Under Saddam Hussein, the Shia population in Iraq was severely repressed. Najaf and Karbala, those two cities together are the Rome of Shia Islam. Because of the terrible suppression by Saddam, the temporary headquarters, the sort of Avignon papacy of the Shia world, was Qum in Iran. So the senior Ayatollahs were in Qum, or London. Now, the promise that the Second Iraq War held out after liberating Iraq was that the theological center of gravity would move from Qum back to Najaf and Karbala, where indeed Ayatollah Sistani went, and where Ayatollah al-Houthi tried to return, and he was murdered there in the spring of 2003. When that happened, my heart sank. Ayatollah al-Houthi and Sistani represented the traditional Shia theological orthodoxy of quietist Shia Islam, where you endure whatever you have to in the current political order, because what we're really waiting for is the return of the Mahdi. And so it doesn't have an activist revolutionary program. Now the Iranians understood this, and therefore they wanted to get in Iran and into Iraq and co-opt the theological center of gravity moving back there. That was the greatest threat to their legitimacy, because traditional Shiism does not include the Velayat-e Faqih doctrine of the rule of the jurisprudence in Iran that Ayatollah Khomeini instigated. So this was a question of theological legitimacy, which was life and death for Iran, and also for the Ba'ath regime in Syria, for Assad. So the first thing we should have been prepared for in invading that country was in preventing those powers from interfering in the internal affairs of Iraq. And I can tell you that we failed miserably. There was massive internal interference from both Syria and Iraq. You know, at first they tested, as we were going or preparing to go into Iraq, the Iranians were very worried because we were already in Afghanistan and they knew we were going to be able to take out Saddam. So we had Iran flanked. So the Iranians were all cooperation, contacting the United States saying, in your military operations, should any of your pilots be shot down and come into Iranian airspace, we want to tell you, we'll guarantee their safety, return them safely to you, because Iran was afraid. But when they began probing in Iraq and met with no resistance, their fear disappeared. And when Assad started penetrating from the west, he found the same thing. When they set up the rat lines to send in great numbers of jihadists to attack U.S. troops and the Iraqi government. Massive internal interference. In the fledgling media operation of which I was a part, I can tell you before we had anything on the air, Iran had 2 24/7 TV stations in Arabic operating. They had transmitters inside Iraq. General Sanchez, as you know, was one of the ground commanders in Iraq. And the day after he retired, I had a chance to ask him a question. And I said, General Sanchez, knowing that success as we defined it was inimical to the interests of Iran and Syria, why were we not prepared to stop the massive interference from both of those countries in the internal affairs of Iraq? 2-word answer from General Sanchez: significant neglect. Significant neglect. Anyone who understood the Middle East, like my Israeli friend, would know that no one wished us well. Anyone who understood what was at stake for Syria and Iran would know what they would attempt to do. And yet we failed to anticipate that and take any action to it. And of course, as you know, we dissolved the Iraqi army instead of immediately reconstituting it and setting it up to guard the borders or guard the installations. Well, that's all. I have so many mistakes we made in the Middle East, I have to keep going along here. Now, the next mistake of significant magnitude was our misunderstanding of the Arab Spring. Here again, finally, perhaps the American vision was coming true, that the dead hand of the local despots was being removed by the people themselves, and what would replace it? Self-government, blessings of liberty, as this is what these people wished for. And of course, one's heart went out to the people involved in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, hoping that finally some kind of decent rule of law constitutional government could come out of this. That was a completely unrealistic expectation. There were only 3 possible beneficiaries of the outcome of Arab Spring, as they were the only organized entities in the Arab world which could take advantage of the mayhem that was developing. Number 1, the military mukhabarat king or quasi-king, that apparatus. The Islamist apparatus, namely the Muslim Brotherhood, as it had monopolized the Islamic education system and monopolized the mosques. They'd been preparing for this moment for 80 years. They were organized, highly disciplined. They were in a position to benefit from it. And the only other institution that would be the tribes. So it would be one of those 3. Well, of course, one of those 3 had already been running things. So if there was an overthrow, one of the other 3 would take over from it. And it would depend on what part of the Middle East we're talking about, because in some areas of it the tribes are strong, like Somalia or Libya. In some places the tribes aren't so strong, and it's other, affiliations through the ruler or the Islamists. And so it was. The hopes of the Arab Spring were dashed, and we saw in the largest Arab country an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood takeover. The nightmare for the United States. The Muslim Brotherhood began in 1928, 4 years after the dissolution of the last caliphate. The Muslim Brotherhood began precisely with the mission of restoring the caliphate. That's been its purpose since its beginning. Now, almost every Islamist and terrorist group in the Sunni world is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, including Hamas, including Al-Qaeda, including Al-Nusra. They're all offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood. They, in some way or another, share in the ideology of the Brotherhood, perhaps in a more radical way or with different tactical understanding of the situation. Yet what should the United States do under President Obama? But celebrate, but welcome the Muslim Brotherhood Egyptian presidency under Mohamed Morsi. It had been the policy of the Obama administration from the beginning to embrace the Muslim Brotherhood. When Obama made his famous speech in Cairo in 2009, he arranged for Muslim Brotherhood figures to be in the first row. As a consequence of which, of course, President Mubarak didn't go, and senior members of his administration didn't go. That was the Obama signal that the Muslim Brotherhood is fine with the United States. Now, a year afterwards, the largest, apparently appears to have been the largest demonstrations in human history in Egypt, overthrew President Morsi, who had assumed powers beyond the dreams of the pharaohs. He had done exactly what anyone who understood the Muslim Brotherhood would do, which is to create an authoritarian leading to a totalitarian regime. And thank heavens, the Egyptian military stepped in at the behest of these enormous civilian demonstrations and put an end to that Morsi presidency. As a consequence of which, of course, the Obama administration suspended military relationships and aid to Egypt because al-Sisi had just saved America's strategic interests in the Middle East. But he has to be punished for that. This attitude toward the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, could be manifest in Obama's visit to the local mosque in Baltimore the other week. In all of his talks about Islam, he has never gone to Muslims who reject the Muslim Brotherhood, who in fact are the intellectual reform wing of Islam. It's small, but it's there. And there are any number of people who don't want to be co-opted by the Muslim Brotherhood, who unfortunately more or less are because of the focus of this administration. Now, what I should do is go over some fundamental theological and philosophical issues that are embedded in the Middle East to an extent that is beyond the comprehension of most Americans because they haven't acquainted themselves with this theology. There was a huge battle in the Muslim world in the 9th century over the status of reason. The caliphate at that point was located in Baghdad. It was absorbing the impact of Greek philosophy and Hellenic thinking. It had set up the House of Wisdom. It had set up an enormous translation effort to have these Greek texts translated. First they were in Syriac and then into Arabic. The first Arab Muslim philosopher, Al-Kindi, appeared. This was the efflorescence. This was when people talk about the golden age of Islam. It's Baghdad, first half of the 9th century. A tremendously promising period. Now, the nature of the theological struggle that took place at that time and the status of reason was whether God himself was reason or whether he was pure will and power. And the Mutazilite side, sponsored by the Caliph, said God is reason. He's given us our reason to understand the rational order of his creation, through which to come to know him, and through which to come to know the difference between right and wrong. For he's given us free will so that we may choose that right. And we can understand what he wants us to do through our reason simply by examining his creation. Not just Muslims, anyone, all men can do this. In addition, of course, we find that God has spoken to us, has given us his revelation, and we are to understand that revelation in terms of reason. And if there's anything unreasonable in it, we're not understanding it correctly, because it must be brought into a court of reason. Primacy of reason held place in Islam at that time. The opposition rose, the Ash'arites, to say God isn't reason, he's pure will and power. He can do anything, he's not bound by anything. There is no natural law. Everything happens as a direct result of God's will. No one has any power but God, and all things are determined by him. For example, oops, what happened there?
God's will.
Bill got it straight. The rest of you have committed the sin of shirk, which is blasphemy in Islam. It was God's will that made the pen fall, not gravity. Otherwise, you would be associating something with God and saying there is some rule outside of him that orders or determines things. So it's God is the first and only cause. There are no subsidiary cause. There's no causality. There's no cause and effect in the world. Fire doesn't burn cotton, God does. Gravity doesn't make the rock fall, God does. As you might imagine, the embrace of this extraordinary metaphysics and theology brought that efflorescence of culture under the Mutazilite caliphs to a close, or at least it began dying out. And if you are wondering why today in the Arab world it comes in next to last except for sub-Saharan Africa, and this is according to the UN Human Development Reports written all by Arabs, next to last in every category of human development: education, healthcare, GDP, number of patents. South Korea produces more patents in a year than the entire Arab Muslim world. Spain in a single year, I choose Spain because my wife is Spanish, sitting patiently in the back of the room, translates more books in a year than the Arab Muslim world has done in the last 1,000 years. So you see what was a once great civilization fall into this state of dysfunction. And the thesis of the book that Jeff was kind enough to mention, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, is the story of how a deformed theology led to a dysfunctional culture. And that's what we are faced with in the Middle East today. I want to give you just a little sample of how this plays out. The word mind in Arabic is etymologically derived from the name of the process of tying together cattle legs so that they cannot move or stand. So it's a binding thing. It prevents you. It doesn't allow you. Now, the greatest theologian of the Asherite movement on the primacy of power and the denigration of reason had this to say. That's, by the way, Muhammad al-Ghazali. Quote, "The mind, once it testifies to the truthfulness of the prophet, must cease to act." The mind, once it testifies to the truth of the prophet, must cease to act. Now, King Hussein of Jordan, in the last interview he gave before he died to an American journalist, he was asked this: "Would you agree that the Muslim decline can be dated from the 9th century when Islam missed the chance to become a religion of reason and moderation by crushing the Mu'tazilite movement?" King Hussein answers, "That is essentially correct, and we must do what we can to change that now." Unquote. Well, I actually work with Muslims who are trying to change that now. And they are exactly the Muslims to which this administration does not turn to in either acknowledgement or support. And they're not alone in doing that. I'd have to say, I served in the Bush administration. They didn't do it either. Not through any antagonism to them, but just simply through ignorance. They didn't even have any idea who they were. I know we're running out of time quickly here. We're still doing all right? Okay, I want to give you another sample. So the antagonism to reason seeps in. So you understand its depth. My friend, Dr. Tawfiq Hamid, was a member of the most violent terrorist organization in Egypt, Al-Gama al-Islamiyah, the ones who attacked the Western tourists at the, what was the site? Slaughtered those people. That's Tawfiq's group, Al-Gama al-Islamiyah. Now, he was recruited in medical school, and his recruiter and handler was named Mukhtar. So Tawfiq relates this experience with Mukhtar. Quote, "On the way to the mosque, Mukhtar emphasized the central importance in Islam of the concept of al-fikr kufr, the idea that the very act of thinking, fikr, makes one become an infidel, kufr. The very act of thinking makes you an infidel. He told me, quote, your brain is just like a donkey that can get you only to the palace door of the king, Allah. To enter the palace, once you have reached the door, you should leave the donkey, your inferior mind, outside." Unquote. By this parable, Mukhtar meant that a truly dedicated Muslim no longer thinks but automatically obeys the teachings of Islam. Unquote. And so if you go to Saudi websites and so forth, you'll read, "Abandon reason and submit to the text." And they have. And look what they have. Now, I want to quickly go a little bit, since jihad was in the title of this talk, something about the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood teachings as presented in the ideology put forth by Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is perhaps the most prominent Islamist ideologue, hanged by Nasser, so he died some years ago. But if you examine the jihadi literature of a 20th century thinker, it's Qutb that will be quoted the most frequently. Now, here's what's wrong with Islamism. And it's the same thing that's wrong with any totalitarian ideology. What does, let's take a brief look at the worldview of monotheism as expressed in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. It goes something like this. Here we have the universe, of which we're inside, and transcending the universe is God. He created the universe from nothing. He holds it into existence, and he has spoken to his creatures in it. And in this revelation, this transcendent God tells us how to behave, what to do and what not to do. And if we obey, if we do what he tells us to do and avoid doing what he tells us not to do, after we die, we will appear before the seat of judgment and either go to paradise or down to Gehenna, to hell. Both of which take place outside of time, outside of history, in this transcendent, ultimate judgment by a just God. Does that fit the general picture of the monotheistic God? I think so. Now this is what is transformed by Qutb and the other Islamists that will help us see it as a totalitarian enterprise. I'm quoting from Qutb here. Islam chose to unite earth and heaven in a single system. So now we don't have the utterly transcendent God and this immanent earth. There's now a single, it's a single system. This means, I'm quoting from him, that the patent purpose of establishing God's law on earth is not merely an action for the sake of the next world. For this world and the next world are but two complementary stages. Harmonizing with the divine law does not mean that man's happiness is postponed to the next life. Rather, it makes it real and attainable in the first of the two stages. In other words, transcendent ends will be achieved by earthly means. As Qutb says, quote, to reestablish the kingdom of God upon earth, or to create a new world. Elsewhere he says, universal adoption of the divine law would automatically mean man's complete emancipation from all forms of enslavement. What does that sound like? Emancipation from all forms of enslavement. It's Marxism. So he's saying that the transcendent and the earthly, the distinction between them has been eliminated, and we can do here what we thought only God could do there. So we needn't wait for the final justice before his seat of judgment. We can do that here. Guess what that requires, however? It requires two things: omniscience and omnipotence. The omniscience will be in the totalitarian state mukhabarat, and the omnipotence will be in the all-powerful state or caliphate, which is now justified by having erased the distinction between the transcendent and the terrestrial. This makes Islamism an ideology exactly like Nazism and communism. Although they weren't religious, they were quasi-religion, they were substitute religions, this is turning a religion into an ideology. And so it is I must tell you that this idea that these people are just some kind of ruffians or criminals displays a determined misunderstanding or refusal to understand exactly what they are. They are millenarian ideologues, and in the case of the current caliphate in the Islamic State, apocalyptic millenarians, who are going to precipitate and bring the end of history and thus the ultimate triumph of Islam in, guess where? Dabiq. In Dabiq, Syria. Their monthly magazine is called Dabiq. It's the town in northern Syria that they occupy, and its significance comes from Islamic apocalyptic literature in the Hadith, which foretells Dabiq as being the final battle between the Romans. You know who they are? You. The Romans and the Muslims, and of course the Romans and the Jews fighting together, in which this will precipitate the arrival of Dajjal. Dajjal is the great deceiver, the kind of antichrist in Islam. And at that point, Christ returns. Christ, as you know, Jesus Christ is a significant figure in the Quran. And in the Hadith literature, it shows Jesus comes back to defeat the Dajjal and to break all the crosses and kill all the pigs. I'm not making that up. That's in the Hadith. So this idea that you keep hearing from Western leaders and from Obama that these people have no ideas. They're just thugs. They're a criminal organization. Yeah, this is for law enforcement, and that's not what they are. If anyone had described the Nazi Party this way, or the Communist Party this way, come to think of it, Alf, they actually did. They so misunderstood the nature of the Soviet Union that some people did mistake it. And so we are misunderstanding these people in this way. Now, there's another very serious problem in trying to defeat these people. They are responding to a yearning in the Muslim population in general to the humiliation in which they have been living for hundreds of years. Islam is the religion of power and success, and yet Muslims have no success and very little power. And unlike the 19th century, ever since the revolution in communications, satellite television has pushed this in their face on a daily basis, that inferiority can be seen. In addition to which they're being infected by Western secular values and pornography and the rest of the story. So when someone else, such as al-Baghdadi, the new caliph, promises a kind of redemption from this position of humiliation and a restoration of Islamic pride and power, this reverberates. This calls Muslims, as you know, what people from 60 countries have gone into the Islamic State to fight on their behalf. So the potential danger from this and its apocalyptic dimensions is huge. Now, why doesn't Islam clean up its own backyard on this one? And here we have a very big problem. And the problem is that al-Baghdadi's not making anything up. Osama bin Laden wasn't making anything up. They pull almost exclusively from Islamic sources. So it's very hard to delegitimize them Islamically. In fact, the head of Al-Azhar has not done it. Oh, I forgot to tell you that Obama did it at the Baltimore Mosque. He said that the Islamic State, they're apostates. Now that really impresses Muslims because they know Obama is a mullah or an ayatollah or a qadi. And you wonder what what could he be thinking of? What could he be thinking of that anyone would listen to him, or that he has the authority of saying who's a real Muslim and who isn't? That's for Muslims to do, not for him. He's not confusing any Muslims regarding this, he's only confusing us. And of course he's confusing our strategy because it shows he doesn't understand some essential things. I taught for a year at National Defense University in the Counterterrorism Fellows Program, and a third of my students were Muslim officers from around the Middle East and South Asia. And the smartest one I had was the most pious Muslim in my class. Very wonderful student. And he said to me one day, bin Laden is right. 95% of what he says is Islam. And you can't say that's not Islam. It's 95% right. So I said, Colonel, okay, where does he get the other 5%? Let's find that out and see if it doesn't create an opportunity for us. Now, one of the problems, however, in delegitimizing them is this. Let's read you this short statement from a wonderful Egyptian scholar, since deceased, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. He was a Muslim intellectual reformer, which is why he had to flee the country and live in the Netherlands. But he said this, quote, if we followed the rules of interpretation developed from the classical science of Quranic interpretation, it is not possible to condemn terrorism in religious terms. It remains completely true to the classical rules in its evolution of sanctity for its own justification. This is where the secret of its theological strength lies. Period, unquote. Did you get the significance of that statement? That's the problem. That doesn't mean that all Muslims are terrorists or attracted to Qutb's ideology. The problem is that there is a kind of continuity from the most liberal Muslim all the way over to the most radical, violent Muslim. And there are no breakwaters in there where you can say, well, no, you're the Muslim, you're the Muslim, because it's kind of seamless and it goes across the entire spectrum. This leads to a kind of desperation, and none was expressed better than by President al-Sisi in Egypt. And I'll close by reading you his passionate plea to the mullahs at Al-Azhar, the most prestigious institution of learning in the Muslim world, Al-Azhar. So here's al-Sisi talking to them. And he says, quote, it is inconceivable that the ideology we sanctify should make our entire nation a source of concern, danger, killing, and destruction all over the world. It has reached the point that this ideology is hostile to the entire world. Is it conceivable that 1.6 billion Muslims would kill the world's population of 7 billion so that they could live on their own? This is inconceivable. I say these things here at Al-Azhar before religious clerics and scholars. May Allah bear witness on Judgment Day to the truth of your intentions regarding what I say to you today. You cannot see things clearly when you are locked in this ideology. You must emerge from it and look from outside in order to get closer to a truly enlightened ideology. You must oppose it with resolve. Let me say it again. We need to revolutionize our religion. Honorable Imam, the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, You bear responsibility before Allah. The world in its entirety awaits your words, because the Islamic nation is being torn apart, destroyed, and is heading to perdition. We ourselves are bringing it to perdition." Unquote. President al-Sisi of Egypt. Have you heard any Western leader? Have you heard President Obama echo this statement? Point to the fact that the leader of the largest Arab country in the world has made such a statement? Spoken to the veracity of this statement and analysis? Or rather gone to visit a Muslim Brotherhood mosque and tell them that everything is fine? So this is how deep this problem runs. This is how deep these misunderstandings are. And they are going to cause tremendous trouble. I want to close with one other thing about Iran and this agreement. Remember, the consistent foreign policy of the United States in the Middle East was not to allow a hegemonic power antithetical to our interests that would have control over those oil resources. And what have we done now in our agreement with Iran? Invited the rise of such a hegemonic power antithetical to our interests. Now, toward the end of World War II, President Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins made a strategic blunder of catastrophic proportions. They decided that the post-war order would rest upon the good intentions of Uncle Joe Stalin. And Harry Hopkins said, well, everything we're arranging here, all our hopes, of course, they're only good so long as Uncle Joe is okay. In other words, so long as he doesn't die, then our dreams can come true here. A strategic miscalculation of terrific proportions. But at least Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins had the excuse that the Soviet Union was our wartime ally. So you'd think, well, a misperception could arise from that association and having fought Nazi Germany together. President Obama has no such excuse for the strategic blunder of similar magnitude that he is making toward Iran today. It is simply staggering. Into the vacuum that he helped create, he is inviting a power inimical to our strategic interests to become the hegemon, which of course has alarmed all our former Sunni allies in the area. And we get upset if they're providing support to the Islamic State, when the Islamic State is the only Sunni group fighting the Shia. I mean, can you shoot yourself in the head simultaneously both ways? Because that's basically what we're approaching here. So I hope today I have lightly touched upon the problem of deciphering the Middle East and why we so often get it wrong. And I hope we have time for some questions, Jeff. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, please, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Dr. Laura Core, and I specialize in terrorist radicalization, recruitment, and de-radicalization. Now, those are on a spectrum very far apart, but what unites them is ideology, which you spoke quite a bit to, and about the issue of stakeholders. In other countries, when they have their counterterrorism programs, their key stakeholders are trained, receive money and protection. And they routinely surveillance these people. They go into prisons, they go into varying places such as mosques. In the United States, you suggested several stakeholders that would have more sway than several politicos that you mentioned. Do you see in the United States a good counter-narrative program that would support such stakeholders and protect them that other countries have done?
No. I don't see us, the field in which I've worked most often and actively is public diplomacy. And that effort has been so damaged and misconceived, I would think it would be better for we to simply stop everything we're doing, because it's causing more damage. It's inciting problems. But in dealing with this larger issue of recruitment and how it is you see people in Western societies where supposedly all their dreams come true, and who are living rather well, why they would go to Syria or Iraq, or why they'd strap bombs on themselves. And I don't think the answer is quite so mysterious as to why they do this. They do it to gain identity, purpose, and meaning. In Europe, with which I'm very familiar and have spent considerable time, there's a vacuum. Now, we, through our foreign policy, have created very dangerous vacuums in the Middle East, which is why we're facing some of the problems we have. But there's a spiritual vacuum that is even more dangerous. And there's also a theological safe haven that's far more dangerous than a physical safe haven, which we have given to the Islamists, which President Obama has generously afforded them. But he's not the only one. This is a bipartisan problem. And unless you approach this problem at the level at which it exists, which is the provision of identity, meaning, and purpose, the rapper who went over, I forget whether he's the one who executed James Foley, had a song, a rap in Great Britain is that who's going to give me meaning? Well, they are. Is meaning on offer from anywhere else in Great Britain today? If you know it well, you know that it's not. And that's part of the problem, is the spiritual problem. And no one's going to offer any kind of counter-narrative that's going to have any effect that isn't dealing with things at a spiritual level. Sorry if that's too long an answer. Yes, ma'am.
I just did a project for school where I was trying to, hypothetically attack the issue in the Twin Cities. They have like a big, Somali population, and I was trying to go after young teens, and exactly what you just said is the approach I took, so that makes me feel good. But my question is more of looking for a comment from you. A lot of times I've heard Muslims say that, they don't understand why terrorists say that they're doing what they're doing because what they're reading in the Quran for Allah. Like, I just read the book I Am Malala, and she says in there that none of, they say they're standing for this, but none of that is in the Quran. That's not. So I'm just curious why, and she says if you can read the old Arabic it's in, which a lot of them can't, none of it's stated in there. So I'm just curious why they say like this rhetoric like that, if it is in the Quran and it does.
Yeah, of course it is. It's in the Quran and it's in the Hadith, but there are peaceful sections of the Quran. As I say, Islam is a religion of peace, except when it isn't. So you can find, as one Muslim said, he got in a lot of trouble in Egypt for saying this. He said the Quran's like a shopping cart. You just go in there and put whatever you want, and that's what you can get out of it. I'll tell you what embarked me upon a intense 10-year study of Islam. Osama bin Laden's first video after 9/11, he quoted his spiritual mentor, the Palestinian thinker Abdullah Azzam. And the quote from Abdullah Azzam is, quote, "Terrorism is an obligation in Allah's religion," unquote. Terrorism is an obligation in Allah's religion. I thought, well, I think I better study Muslim theology, and that's what I did. The whole point of Benedict XVI's Regensburg lecture on the status of reason was to say, unless, if God is not reason, then behaving unreasonably isn't wrong. Because reason is no longer a standard of right and wrong. And if you remove reason or logos from your conception of God's essence, then there's no barrier to this terrorism. There's no point at which you could say, well, this is wrong because God is reason and behaving unreasonably is wrong. And therefore, forced conversion to your religion is wrong because that's behaving unreasonably. You see, the slate has been wiped clean here with the defeat of the idea that God is reason, which was one of the central teachings of the Mutazilite theology that was forcibly suppressed in the 9th century with the theology of God as pure will and power, which replaced it. And that's why there's nowhere in there where you can say stop. I mean, most of people aren't disposed to behave, most Muslims are not disposed to behave that violently, but there's nowhere you can say, well, it's wrong for you to go over there, where they do. And certainly, I mean, in the Hadith and the Quran have ample justification for this behavior, unfortunately. And the other, well, one last thing I want to say to you is that these Islamists are doing something differently. There is a tradition of Islamic jurisprudence which limits what Muslims can do in warfare that was developed in the Middle Ages and so forth. What the Islamists have said is they said, no, we are going back to the Quran and the Hadith, and we're going to wipe out centuries of Islamic jurisprudence, which would otherwise prevent us from doing what we wish to. They are the Islamic reformists. So people who say, well, what Islam needs is a reformation, I say, well, be careful what you wish for, because that is the Islamic Reformation. It's already taken place. That is the Islamic Reformation. Sorry for such. Bill.
Well, when you talk about the Islamic Reformation, I mentioned this at the Naval War College, that Wahhabism was the Reformation. But as a sidebar, Calvinism did a lot to destroy European art. But moving forward a bit, going actually back to the war business, the first Desert War should be looked at as an 18th century balance of power war. We checked the Iraqis so they could check the Iranians. The second one ignored every guideline of how to run a war, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, etc. What I encountered out there was the profound ignorance and hostility of our own people to the historical situation. And when some of us in Army Civil Affairs suggested that the Hashemites be restored to Iraq because there was a great sentiment for it, the hostility I ran into was incredible. Only the ignorance of the place superseded it. So we ended up with this absolute mess out there, a lot of which goes right back to Bremer and disbanding the Iraqi army, which had given up under promises that they would reorganize things and everything would run right along.
That we'll take care of you. Don't fight us and we'll take care of you.
The imams, and my source is Michael Azadi, who's an advisor at Special Operations School, teaches up at Fordham. The imams had said, don't fight the Americans, don't resist them. Because if they had resisted, it would have been a bloody mess.
No, I can't agree with you more. I remember when someone I knew was going over to Iraq as a civilian contractor to work in the sort of war of ideas side of things. He said, do you have any books to recommend? And I said, well, how about a history of Iraq? He said, hey, that's a great idea. No, exactly.
When I told the Iraqis that I had studied under Sidney Fisher in Ohio State, Oh, you know Fisher, come, we must talk. Because his book was throughout the East. They knew more about it than our own people.
I wonder if you can make some comment on the similarity between this idea of an eternal struggle of Marxism, that there is no rest, everything is political, everything is a struggle, and the idea of the Ghazi warrior, the continual struggle between Islam and the infidels.
That's exactly the same in Marxism and in Islamism, that the struggle is eternal. Well, not exactly eternal, because history comes to an end, as it will supposedly near Gabik, when Islam will be triumphant. But until then, it's a state of constant hostility and hatred. And as Sayyid Qutb makes clear, I've quoted extensively from him in my book, that hatred is the essence, and that one must never stop hating. This reminded me so much of Lenin, who said, and I'm quoting, "Hatred is the basis of communism." And so hatred is the basis of this, too. Sir?
To be resident jackass.
As long as you don't call me that.
No, there's always one guy in a crowd. Having been a participant from 83, 1991, and 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not too badly anything. Our friends, the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Syrians, and just about everybody else but the Iraqis, told us to stop at the border and leave him alone. George H.W. Bush heeded his friends, and they were his friends, and stopped at the border. Leave it alone. Keep the bulwarks. Let them solve it incrementally themselves. 2003, the son decided that he knew better. I'm not going to buck the argument. Having been a participant, the Iraqi divisions among their society are irreconcilable from a little power who's only 250 years old and knows nothing. I'm not going to stop right there. However, the present conflicts are reminiscent completely of the 60s and 70s. A true believer of the heaven on earth. Before it was Marxism, now it's Islamism. It will exhaust itself because 99.9% of the Islamic peoples, whom I don't pretend to speak for, by the way, but between my friends and my acquaintances and having dealt with the Afghan and Iraqi forces and all that, and I can claim particularly Afghans as many of my friends, I signed a lot of their papers to get them their visas over. They don't believe it.
Don't believe what?
They don't believe in the caliphate. They don't believe in this dominance of Allah over everybody. Even my very conservative friends, who are very antagonistic to Israel, very sympathetic to the Middle East and all of the humiliations of the last 200 years. The Chinese have the same thing, by the way.
Oh, sure. You better
the way they are. It will exhaust itself. You have young people who are believing in the kingdom of heaven on earth, which is where our dash comes from. It is belief, and it will exhaust itself. It is not existential threat. It's an annoyance. Okay, it took us 15 years to kill 5,000 American soldiers, my brother. 5,000 soldiers is pocket change compared to what they want to do. Eventually, their own people will turn. I've already turned on. Southern Afghanistan sells opium to anybody. There's nothing but corruption everywhere. So much for Islamic Puritanism. Wahhabism doesn't exist anywhere. It's these preachers and the occasional young people who follow them. I realize this is somewhat disjointed. It is not. It is simply another irritant in the process of civilization. Within 20 years, this whole thing will have been disappeared, just like socialism did. It will take this generation to simply get themselves killed. And many of them end up coming back from Syria and Iraq totally disillusioned from what they see. This is our fault for not letting them solve their own problem. Enough, I'm done.
Well, there's
I could preach forever on this.
Oh, there's a lot of wisdom in what you have said.
Don't encourage me, please.
No, you're absolutely right that it will exhaust itself. The question, because it's embraced a version of unreality, and reality is always, yeah, people are resistant to unreality. Reality is unresistant to unreality. So it will exhaust itself. The question is, how much damage will it do in the interim? And you know, the analogy that Muslims often use to the current situation when they're trying to come up with bad names for either Al-Qaeda or Daesh is the Kharijites. And the Kharijites were a 7th century, they were the first Takfiri branch of Islam, puritanical branch of Islam, and I have read contemporaneous accounts of how the Kharijites behaved, and it's hair-raising material, and the only thing you would have to change to apply it today is instead of the scimitar, it's an explosive belt or a grenade. It's just the weapons have changed, but the Kharijites would go into a Muslim village and just slaughter everyone because they weren't following the pure Islam.
They turn on their own far more.
As they conceived it. But and this, of course, appalled more Orthodox Muslims, but it took them more than a century to take care of the Kharijites. So it's not a little problem. Now, there's one other thing I'd like for you to consider. Appreciating the great wisdom that you have gained from your extensive experience.
Oh, I don't consider great wisdom.
No, I respect what you said very, very deeply and agree with just about all of it. Here's the problem. The approach to Al-Qaeda was, of course, we kill the leadership and, they'll fade away and everything will be restored to normal. Now that line has changed, or well, it's al-Nusra, and now it's Islamic State. And if we wipe them out, then everything will go back to normal. No, it won't. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, are simply manifestations of a far deeper cultural problem. That if you whack-a-mole here, it's going to manifest itself in another way. And the reason is because Islamic civilization, if you can still even speak of it in those terms, or in culture, particularly in the Arab world, is in a state of collapse because it's on a collision course with the modern world. They have no means with which to enter the modern world in the majority conception of Sunni Islam. It's not available to them. It doesn't mean that the normal person doesn't go about life, daily life, in a way that we can recognize. And as you know, I have many Muslim friends whom I've worked with. But the profundity of the fundamental theological problem means that it's not going to be solved with a social problem, an economic program, a psychological program. It needs to be solved at the theological level. Abdul Karim Saroush was an Iranian revolutionary supporter of the regime in '79. He became disillusioned. He now lives in Canada or Germany. He's a great thinker and writer. I want to finish my answer to you in this way. When he's talking about the possibility of having a decent rule of law, constitutional life in the Muslim world. Quote, without a different theology, can one have democracy? You need some philosophical underpinning, even theological underpinning, in order to have a real democratic system. Your God cannot be a despotic God anymore. A despotic God would not be compatible with a democratic rule, with the idea of rights. So you have to change your idea of God, unquote. Now, a Syrian Muslim intellectual reformer told me, he said, I felt I was in a theological prison, and Arabic was part of that prison. And until I learned French, I couldn't escape from the prison. And do exactly what General al-Sisi said, is see the problem from the outside. Now, in this, Closing of the Muslim Mind, by the way, has been, the Arabic translation is ready to go. So I need to upgrade my home security system.
God help you.
Or be prepared to act as a
You have time for one more question.
Well,
Just fly a ISIS flag in front of your house, and the FBI will provide you a lot of security.
Obama might come visit. But the point is, there's at the Westminster Institute, we published a book called Reforming Islam, all written by Muslim intellectual reformers. And the value of this wonderful book is when people get angry at what I have said about Islam and say, oh, Reilly, you must be an Islamophobe. I say, oh, look at chapter 4 in Reforming Islam. Is Muhammad Arkoun Islamophobe? Oh, no, he's a Muslim. How could he be? Well, what about that? Well, look at chapter 14. Now, Muslim intellectual reformers recognize and are saying the very same thing. Ma'am, I'm sorry.
Ann Pierce, I'm an author and foreign policy analyst. And I agree with you about the nature of Islamist extremism. I look forward to reading your book and learning a lot more. My question is sort of a what-if question. In 2008, Islamist extremism was on the rise, but movements for freedom throughout the Middle East and the Arab world were very much on the rise also, and all the surveys at the time showed that such a large percentage of Arab people were tired of the stagnation that comes from socialist governments and from the repression and looking for an alternative. So my question is, what if in 2008, at that sort of turning point, that rather than nurture the one, we had nurtured the other? What if we had reached out to the pro-democracy movements and, for example, in Egypt, rather than base our policy on outreach to the Muslim Brotherhood, had created a more balanced policy? Or when the Iranians took to the streets and put up signs saying, Obama, are you with us? We had not responded with silence. Or when one of the most brutal regimes the world has ever seen, the Syrian regime, we had not gone along with Russian and Iranian plans for the Syrians, which made the situation so much worse, but it had actually shown some compassion, and on and on and on, and had not, abetted all the Russian and Iranian plans, and had not even abetted the Shiite regime in Iraq and the way they worked with Iran toward a much more repressive approach to the Sunnis. So it's kind of a what-if question. What if at that kind of pivotal time?
Yeah. Well, it's more than, it's an excellent question. It's more than one question.
Yeah.
No, because the situations were fundamentally different. In Iran, I thought it was an enormous missed opportunity on the part of Obama to do what he did, or more accurately, to do what he didn't. The problem in Iran is not the Iranian people, it's the Iranian regime. But he made his calculation that if he said nothing about those enormous street demonstrations, that the Ayatollahs would give him a good nuclear deal. Very bad miscalculation. And if anyone is ready for a constitutional democratic regime, it's the Iranians. Because Shia Islam is fundamentally different in its attitude both toward reason and philosophy than is Sunni Islam. So, as one Iranian said to me, hey, you invaded the wrong country. You should have freed us. We're ready for this kind of thing. Just quick, I'll get to you next. Now, the answer on The Arab Middle East is different. I know about the surveys, that they're all for democracy and freedom. But when you scratch the surface and you go underneath there to see what does that mean, you ask them a question such as, do you believe that all, for instance, the fundamental principle of democratic constitutional rule, do you believe that all people are created equal? Of course not. Do you believe men and women are created equal? No. Do you believe Muslims and non-Muslims, not to say Jews, are created equal? No. In Egypt, do you believe people should be executed for apostasy? 84% of the population? Yes. Yes, they'd like to be free. They'd like to see their side in the ascendant. But when you see what does freedom mean, it doesn't mean what we think it means. And the fact that there was no side in Tahrir Square with whom to side on the Democratic. They had no organization, they had no institutions, there was no part of civic society that could have possibly carried that. And the young Twitter guy, as it turned out, had Muslim Brotherhood ties. So it's not quite what it appears to be. Now, Tunisia is a different story because it was a secular state and it had an educational curriculum for many, many decades that laid the foundation for something like this. And one hopes that they can continue on their path without succumbing to Islamism. But for the rest of the Arab Middle East, the place is falling apart. The post-Ottoman order imposed by the imperial powers is unglued. I mean, nations like Egypt, which have their, an identity going back millennia, they'll hold on. Iran, another ancient civilization, it'll hold on. Turkey, at least parts of it will hold on. The rest of it is absolutely up for grabs. And we can stand back, and it's going to be very violent for a very long time because of the denigration of reason in their culture. There's no way to adjudicate disagreements except by violence and force. And that's the way they're going to settle it, and it's going to be a vicious fight. And the problem is with this vicious fight is that the outside powers are picking proxy forces to preserve their interests in there, as we know. I'm sorry, this gentleman's been waiting all over.
I'm kind of interested, you talked about a lot of aspects of the ideas, the propaganda back and forth, some military operations and so on. What about some of the really tangible things we're doing? I mean, basically what we're doing now is injecting a lot of money into the area. We're showing them our latest weapons. What about, how is that going to play out?
It's not playing out very well. There's no evidence that we have any idea what we're doing there. I don't see any coherent policy. And until we have one, I would not be in favor of putting American boots on the ground there. Sir, no, wait a minute. We have to go to someone.
We can take one 30-second question, and that's it.
And a 15-second reply, right? Sir.
Could you clarify something for me aside from, I understand the spiritual conflict in Islam, aside from that? You've got Alawite Assad, who's pals with Shiite Iran, yet you had Sunni Saddam, who was a Ba'athist person, and which I understand Assad is also Ba'athist. So you've got two Ba'aths, political, from what I understand, political, secular, fascist, secular government that I understand the UAR was once Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. I think Nasser at one time wasn't he a Ba'athist?
Yes, they're all.
Okay. I mean, just the conjecture. Reconcile that for me. I mean, why, are the Ba'athists still, I mean, Assad has his, he has Ba'athist the reason why he's still in power a lot has to do with his fascist authoritarian control of the country. Is that maybe my speculative question is that maybe an alternative to having a reconstituted Ottoman Empire or Persian Empire, to have a secular government in the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, the kind of a super UAR? Will that work?
No. It's already been tried and failed. You know, Baathism was just an emanation of Arab secular nationalism with a dose of socialism and neo-Marxism pumped in there.
Well, they didn't have peace and love, but they had order.
Well, but it also failed. And it's exactly the failure of Arab nationalism and Arab National Socialism that has led to the resurgence in Islamism, because they said you tried this damn ideology from the West, this National Socialism, and that didn't work. Some of you neo-Marxism, that didn't work. The West doesn't work. We need to return to our roots in Islam. And that's the Islamist perspective. And that's what they're trying to do.
I've got to call it to an end because and I want to thank Rob. Thank you very much. There's only 6 people in this town could have given that lecture, and he is most of them.